Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this webinar where we are going to discuss today halting biodiversity decline in agriculture. This webinar is organized by the Natural Capital Initiative, which is a UK-based partnership launched in 2009 involving leading scientific organizations. The partnership is made of three organizations: the Royal Society of Biology, the UK Centre for Ecology and Hydrology, and the James Hutton Institute. The Natural Capital Initiative is a forum in the UK that champions scientific-driven dialogue and policy guidelines to ensure decisions across sectors in order to reflect the value and importance of natural systems. This event is also organized in collaboration with Recodo, a platform, European platform, and an open access knowledge platform developed as part of the Horizon 2020 Framework project. Framework is a project involving farmer clusters for realizing agrobiodiversity management across ecosystems. The Recodo platform has the mission to share knowledge and empower actions across diverse stakeholders, farmers, community groups, NGOs, researchers, and policymakers to support biodiversity-sensitive farming and landscape-scale conservation. So Recodo has the goal to combine open access knowledge, networking tool for farmer clusters, monitoring data sharing systems, citizen science integrations, but also decision support for sustainable land management. Today, we are going to discuss this topic with four speakers. And we have Anna-Camilla Moonen, Kaley Hart, Alison Smith, and David Baldock that is going to join us soon. This webinar has the goal of emphasizing the critical importance of landscape features for farmland biodiversity and focuses on strategies to sustain multifunctional landscape effectively. It delves into the application of spatial measures and explore opportunities for policy changes in the UK and the EU. I want to remind to all our attendees that you are unable to turn videos and microphones on, but you are encouraged to put any questions in the Q&A box that I will be able to address to our speakers. If you want to, you can also send your question anonymously. We have a specific function to do this, ask questions anonymously. This event is also recorded and will be uploaded on the YouTube channel afterwards and posted on the NCI and Recodo webpage. Okay, so it's time to kick off now to introduce our first speaker. Kaley Hart is a policy analyst for the European Union Common Agricultural Policy Network, focusing on environment and climate aspects of the Common Agricultural Policy. She also works as an Associate Research Director at the Institute of European Environmental Policy, leading a project on policy delivery against environmental and climate targets. She's an Honorary Senior Research Fellow in the College of Social Sciences and International Studies at the University of Exeter, a member of the College of Expert and England Offices for Environmental Protection, and sits on the Policy and Campaign Committee of CPRE, the Countryside Charity. My name is Simone Martino, and I'm chairing this interesting discussion today with our speakers. Kaley, it's your turn. You have 15 minutes for your speech. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, and I hope you can see my slides. I hope they're visible. Yes. So thank you very much for inviting me to speak this morning, and hello to everyone. I'm going to start by talking about how the Common Agricultural Policy in the EU is used to support the management and restoration of biodiversity, and it's going to draw on the work of a recent thematic group that we held as part of the EU CAP network called Enhancing Biodiversity for Improved Resilience. And I'll look at some of the examples that members of that group showed us. We were particularly focusing on landscape scale approaches and their potential to deliver for biodiversity and for nature-based solutions. So perhaps before we start just some context of why we need funding under the CAP, the Common Agricultural Policy, because it is one of the major funding sources for biodiversity on agricultural land in the EU. And I don't need to tell you all about the state of biodiversity and its declines, and the fact that agriculture is a major driver. And we're seeing that landscapes are becoming increasingly fragmented, reducing connectivity and leading to declines in biodiversity. But biodiversity decline also has implications for the future resilience of agricultural production. And that's also important to remember, because it provides really important ecosystem services like pollination, natural pest control, and so on. But the other thing I wanted to flag was that last year we had a major new biodiversity law that came into place in the EU, the Nature Restoration Law, and that has some quite significant targets and commitments which also cover agricultural area, requirements to increase the status of grassland biodiversity, farmland birds, landscape features, pollinators and others as well. And while member states don't have to use the CAP to deliver against those objectives, it's likely they're going to want to use the CAP because it's the major source of funding available. So the potential of the CAP, so there are a lot of measures that can be used to support biodiversity, and the ones that are most directly relevant and are used the most in member states are the underlying standards, what's called conditionality. There are requirements for no ploughing of environmentally sensitive permanent grassland, maintaining landscape features is another requirement. And then on top of that are incentives, which we have called eco schemes, the 1-year annual payments, and agri-environment climate, which you'll no doubt be familiar with, which are multi-annual payments. And sometimes these are combined with non-productive investments to fund things like capital items that are needed for habitat restoration, so fencing, things like that. But there are other measures that have potential that I want to talk about, which are on the top layer there. For example, the cooperation measure and the use of advisory services, which can be used specifically for biodiversity purposes, but which are rarely used. And this is important because the evidence shows that despite the fact that we've had decades of agri-environment schemes operating in the EU, the efforts haven't been enough to get the scale of improvements that are needed to reverse the biodiversity declines. But I'll give you some examples later of how those lesser used interventions or measures are used. So the majority of agri-environment schemes in the EU are individual agreements with individual farmers, and each land manager signs up to a specific set of actions on their farms. But and they can be, if well designed, effective in achieving biodiversity effects for species on the parcel of the farm that's in focus. But there's limited evidence of more sustained population level impacts at the local area or at larger scales. So what the evidence is showing us is that if we encourage greater spatial coordination or action at the landscape scale and got larger areas of land to come under agreement, we could actually improve the connectivity of different habitats and encourage mosaics of different habitats throughout the landscape. And that could be achieved in a number of ways. And the most effective approach will, of course, depend on the biodiversity outcomes that need to be achieved. And there are some different ways in which the schemes can be designed to do this. And some of those that have been suggested and trialled in some places are perhaps having a bonus put in place where an additional payment is made if individual land managers' habitats are spatially connected, or if a certain level of uptake of certain actions is secured within a defined area. And this has been done in Switzerland, for example. You can also facilitate collaboration between farmers, but still having individual agreements in place. and you can enable through advice and through facilitators to bring those farmers together to discuss how they're going to use their individual agreements to actually manage the land at a more landscape scale in a more joined up way. Collaborative agreements or joint agreements are another way of doing that, where land managers actually make joint applications with their neighbours into a scheme, and that's often facilitated by a third party like an environmental organisation or a funded facilitator. And then, of course, having longer agreements would also deliver greater benefits for biodiversity. At the moment, some of these funding schemes require schemes to be in place for 5 years, sometimes 7 years. But in some places, you can actually, if you can get the funding commitments for a longer period, for 20 years, for example, then that is also extremely beneficial. So what we did in the EU CAP network is we held a thematic group in autumn of 2024 to look at how to promote collaborative biodiversity action on farmland beyond the single farm. And we were really trying to look at how you could go beyond these individual agreements with farmers. And we had 40 different members in this thematic group, which met over a period of about 6 months, from a whole range of stakeholder groups, from the managing authorities, from research bodies, paying agencies, farming organisations, environmental organisations, and we had members from 21 different member states. And what we did in that was discuss, well, we collected practical examples from them and of initiatives that were in place that were already being trialled to achieve landscape scale action. And we discussed how we could scale up these types of approaches and make them more attractive to farmers, and look at perhaps what the barriers were to doing that. And that led the group to come up with a number of policy recommendations in relation to scheme design, scheme implementation, as well as monitoring, communication and capacity building. And I'll come on to those in a minute. So one of the things, the outputs of this thematic group was this publication of different examples from different member states of what was going on at the landscape scale, and lots of examples were provided, but actually many of them were funded from other sources. So, for example, the LIFE programme or Interreg. The use of the CAP was actually still a bit limited in this area, but I just wanted to spend a little bit of time to show you 4 examples that came up. And the first one is from Austria, and this one is called Erpel Verbindet or Erpel Connects, and Erpel is their agri-environment scheme in Austria. And this is where farmers and biodiversity experts from 3 Austrian regions have joined forces to put in place biodiversity measures within the agri-environment programme. And farmers have to create biodiversity areas on at least 7% of their arable land and their grassland to form connecting habitats. So not just anywhere, but they have to connect. And the farmers and the biodiversity experts worked together to plan and create where these connecting habitats should go. And this is a pilot scheme, but 3 regions were chosen to cover a wide range of land use intensities in Austria, so that the insights from the project and the effects that they achieve could be implemented on a larger scale in the future. And one of the main outcomes of this was that it encouraged a positive mindset around farmers, and it was a practical approach to promote biodiversity for them. There is actually another approach in Austria called the Regional Nature Conservation Plan top-up payment, and this is where specific areas are identified as priorities for nature conservation, and regional plans are developed, and farmers get a top-up if they enter into those into that scheme. The second one is in Ireland, and it relates to an approach to try and increase farm woodlands, focusing on habitat restoration, improved biodiversity, social engagement, and knowledge dissemination. And they've used a catchment sensitive approach to try and collaborate with farmers to encourage these types of activities. It's a small area. It's about 6.5 hectares, about 12 farmers. But this close collaboration has actually enabled quite a lot of activity to take place, and this site has been connected into the wider landscape through establishing wildlife corridors to important areas nearby. The third example is from the Netherlands, and this is where the Dutch managing authority has is trying to support cooperation between dairy farmers to manage their peat meadow areas and Natura 2000 transition areas in order to reduce ammonia emissions. So they're trying to extensify dairy farms close to these nitrogen sensitive Natura 2000 areas and reduce CO2 emissions by raising the groundwater level in the peat meadow areas. So, and this covers a much larger area. This is about 27,000 hectares are currently under agreement in that example. And my last example is from Sweden. This is quite a new approach that they've taken. And what they're trying to do is get collaboration between at least 2 farmers to try and create small habitats on their farm and increase the green infrastructure in fairly simple agricultural landscapes. So the idea behind this is that you increase the landscape heterogeneity, and you should hopefully see increases in pollen, pollinators, nesting areas for birds, and so on and so forth. So I'm coming to the end. I just wanted to flag in my last slide that we asked stakeholders who were part of the thematic group what would be needed to really scale up landscape scale approaches using a mix of different measures, and the key points that they mentioned are just as follows. First, obviously, I guess, we need to increase funding for biodiversity action, particularly for collective action and particularly at the landscape scale. There isn't sufficient money at the moment for those purposes. The second was that piloting and testing new approaches before they're rolled up should become the norm. The cooperation measure is available and able to be used for that, but rarely is. So more piloting and testing of new approaches. The third is to really focus on outcomes, designing more results-based schemes to give farmers greater ownership of the outcomes that they're taking. And another point was this need to invest in data, for example, to understand ex ante the likely impact of actions, for example, through modelling, but also to inform decisions about where to target the schemes to get the best outcomes, to get the right practices in the right place, and also to inform the monitoring of outcomes. So, for example, finding new ways of using satellite data for biodiversity. And then the last 3 are all about communication and capacity building. So really important to be explaining to farmers the reasons about why they need to manage their land for biodiversity, including the economic and social benefits that it brings, so that the added value is really clear, and resilience to climate change that comes from these sorts of activities is important here. Finding new ways of communicating research findings and monitoring results was also flagged. And peer-to-peer learning, finally, not just between farmers, which is often what we talk about, but also peer-to-peer learning between policymakers and implementation bodies to share experiences and increase the understanding of what works. So I hope I haven't gone over too long, and thank you for your time.
Thank you so much, Kaley. Perfect timing, absolutely perfect. Thanks a lot, very interesting. We started receiving some questions. I remind all our attendees that feel free to post your questions in the Q&A chat box, and then I'm going to forward these questions to our speakers at the end. So let's move to the second speaker today. We have Alison Smith. Alison is a senior research associate at Oxford Environmental Change Institute, working with the Leveroom Center for Nature Recovery and Nature-Based Solution Initiative. After 2 decades as a climate and energy policy consultant, Alison joined the university in 2014 to work on ecosystem services and climate change projects. She now specializes in modeling sustainable land use pathway, aiming to maximize benefits and minimize trade-offs. Alison contributes to the FABLE, F-A-B-L-E consortium and the UK's Land Use for Net Zero Hub, and collaborates with policymakers on tools like local nature recovery maps and Nature England's environmental benefits for nature tool. Alison, you can share your screen, and 15 minutes for you. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I'm just going to get my slides into
Absolutely.
presenter mode.
Yeah.
Okay, cool.
We can
Great.
see it,
yeah, so I'm going to focus specifically on exploring alternative pathways to meet climate, food and biodiversity goals using maps and models. So I'm going to look at land sparing and land sparing sharing approaches, and also a combined approach. Then I'm going to look at more holistic pathways to balance trade-offs between goals. And finally, a really quick look at local opportunity maps. And I'll wrap up with some policy recommendations that have emerged from our work. So most of our work has used the FABLE model, and FABLE is a consortium of 24 country teams, all exploring, using their own version of the model to explore national land use strategies. And the way it works is that these 24 national models are combined with 6 rest of the world regions, and that means you can balance global trade and make sure that individual countries are not meeting their own targets by basically just importing more food from everywhere else. And we can then check whether collectively all those national strategies are meeting global targets for food, climate and biodiversity. And if they're not, then clearly we need to raise policy ambition. So just a really quick overview of the FABLE calculator. It has 80 food products and it works in 5-year time steps to 2050, and it's driven by demand. So the input parameters are things like population and diet and food waste. And that is used by the model to work out the demand for food and biofuels. And then it combines that with crop productivity, livestock productivity and grazing density to work out how much cropland and pasture area we need to meet that demand. And then finally, it looks at other demands on the land from things like urban expansion, tree planting targets and protected areas to work out how much farmland is actually available. And if there's not enough land, then basically it means demand is not met, and either people need to eat less food or they need to import more food. And the output from the model is the land use change and the associated greenhouse gas emissions, the land available for biodiversity and food security. And we can then check whether targets are being met. So just a really quick look first at what happens under a land sparing type model compared with the current trends. So for our current trends here, we've got continued current rates of tree planting in the UK, which actually are far below our target areas of tree planting. Continued urban expansion, and then no change in any other parameters apart from a steady growth in population. And for a kind of simplified land sparing approach, we've just got exactly the same apart from a 34% increase in crop productivity. And that actually is quite optimistic, which I'll go into a little bit later on, but that is the value that was used in the UK's 6th carbon budget, the one before last. So these parameters are used to work out how much land we need to meet these food requirements, our current food requirements and future growth. And what we see is that because we've got this steady increase in urban area and new forest planting, we're actually running out of cropland and pasture to meet our food requirements. So we actually don't meet our current demand for food. And that means that either we have to eat less food or we have to import more food. And actually, this is what we're seeing in the UK. So our imports have increased from 30% to 50% over the last 10 years. And that means we're actually generating biodiversity impacts in other countries to meet our own food demand. So under the crop productivity land sparing scenario, we now need less cropland to meet our same food demands, and therefore we no longer run out of food, run out of area to produce food. But there still remains a question, is a 34% increase possible or sustainable without increasing inputs from agrochemicals, for example? And in the most recent carbon budget, they've actually downscaled this assumption of 34% down to just 16% productivity requirements. And also with this scenario, we're not meeting our very ambitious tree planting targets, and we're not meeting our greenhouse gas targets either. And just to kind of emphasize the point on crop yields, this is what's happened in the UK over the last 20 years. We've had basically no increase overall in the main crops, wheat, barley, oats, and oilseed rape. And actually we're getting more fluctuations due to climate extremes. So this really emphasizes that resilience in crop production is becoming really, really important now. And therefore we need to look more, not just at the land sparing, but at more of a land sharing kind of approach. And to do that, we're going to zoom right in now to a kind of case study and use case study maps. And this is some work we did for the Scottish Government based on real farms, but using hypothetical scenarios. So this is Balruddery Research Farm in Scotland, run by JHI, and it's their Centre for Sustainable Cropping. And we're comparing a land sparing and land sharing scenario with this hypothetical, very boring kind of counterfactual, where we've removed all the existing features like hedges, etc. So we're going to compare this with the land sparing scenario. Here we assume that there's a 10% increase in crop yield through things like improved breeding and precision agriculture. And that frees up 10% of the land area for habitat restoration. And we're going to put in 10 hectares of native woodland and 7 hectares of semi-natural grassland with scattered trees. And then for comparison, a land sharing scenario has measures across the whole area of the farm. And this is based on real experiments ongoing at the farm, where they have an integrated package of measures, agroecological measures, based around using low input crop varieties. And that means you can reduce inputs and replace some fertilizer with compost, reduce tillage and support soil health through legume intercrops and cover crops. And that allows beneficial arable weeds to grow. And they're also adding flower strips, beetle banks, and we've modelled hedgerows around all the fields with trees every 100 metres and wide grass margins. And also we've got some strips of silver arable agroforestry across the bottom here. And what we basically did is we mapped all this in GIS to try and work out how much land area it actually takes up. And we do have very generous sort of allocations of widths of strips and things here. But what we found out is it occupies 20% of the existing farmland area. But in terms of the actual crop yields, yields of 5 crops stayed the same under their low input agroecology measures, but yields of wheat, which has been specifically bred for high input systems, decreased by 24% or 20%. So 24%. So what this means is that as wheat occupies 18% of the cropland in Scotland, a kind of weighted average yield across all those crops they looked at would be 4%. And then combined with a 20% decrease in cropped area, got an overall decrease of food production of 24% for this particular scenario. But we're not including any potential products from the agroforestry, which could produce fruit or nuts, for example. And then we looked at a combined scenario where we combine this agroecological approach with increases in crop productivity of 10% again, as for the land sparing scenario. And then for all 3 scenarios, we looked at what this does for ecosystem services using a tool called the Environmental Benefits from Nature tool, which assesses change in 18 different ecosystem services using a fairly simple kind of scoring approach. And what we found is that all 3 scenarios have increases in ecosystem service delivery, but the agroecology scenario has bigger increases, and it's across the whole area, of course. So it offers that resilience to floods and droughts, much higher scores for pollination and beneficial pest predators. But of course, it does have that trade-off for food production. But the combined scenario, which combines increased yield with the agroecology measures, reduces that loss of food production from 24% to 13%. But nevertheless, it is still a loss. So what can we do about that? And that's when we start to look at more holistic policy scenarios. So back to the FABLE model now. And all the countries in the FABLE consortium modelled what they called a global sustainability scenario, or their own version of that, which looks at much more ambitious targets for tree planting. In the UK, we've also said, can we have more compact urban development? So we're not using up so much land for urban. We're sticking with a 34% productivity increase for crops, but we're having agroecology measures on half of our farmland, including agroforestry on 10%, and a big increase in hedgerows. And to try and make space for that, we're going to halve our consumption of meat and dairy, and also halve food waste. And just to kind of show why that's necessary in the UK, as I'm sure it is in many places, this is the kind of map that came out of our national food strategy, which shows the vast area of land used by not just by pasture, but also to produce feed crops for livestock, not just in the UK, but also overseas. So what happens with this more holistic scenario, which includes diet, food waste, and agroecology altogether, is that we now need a much smaller area of pasture, much smaller area of cropland, and that frees up land for nature recovery. And so we're meeting our food production targets. We're not needing to import more food. And we're also massively reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And we're also creating more land for biodiversity. So we've got our extensive grassland. We've also got other natural land being restored, and also a much bigger area of new forests that can be planted as well. And at a global level, looking at all countries together, they did, through this sustainable scenario, managed to meet their carbon targets, and not quite, but almost met their target on land for biodiversity, where natural processes can predominate. But they didn't meet all the targets. So some of the food targets were not met, for example, and also targets on nitrogen and phosphorus fertilizers were absolutely nowhere near being met. So still some work to do on refining those pathways. And then finally, just to mention with the fable modelling, the Welsh Government wanted us to create their own independent fable model tailored to their specific land use and socioeconomic context. That they have very large areas of rough hillside upland grazing. So we worked with their policymakers to adapt the model for Wales. And what they specifically wanted us to look at was a land sparing versus land sharing approach. So they felt that the UK's fifth carbon budget, which was the one in operation at the time, was very focused on a land sparing approach, shifting livestock onto intensive grassland, which frees up lots of land for nature recovery, but it doesn't really suit the Welsh context where they have all this rough grazing and very little intensive farmland. So they wanted us to look at their land sparing approach, which is much more focused on livestock on lightly grazed species-rich grassland and requires a much lower productivity increase as well, so 35%, whereas the land sparing one had a really, really optimistic 65% increase. But what we found was that both these scenarios produce very similar benefits for carbon and greenhouse gases. So they both managed to meet the carbon greenhouse gas targets. And they also both have similar areas of land for biodiversity. Although with the land sparing, it's a different type of land, it's restored natural land. Whereas with the land sharing, it's this lightly grazed species-rich grassland. But the key thing here was that the land sparing pathway, the land sharing pathway, I've misprinted there, provided a viable alternative that was much more in tune with the Welsh policy context. And finally, a really quick look at local opportunity mapping. So again, looking at how important it is to tailor solutions to the local context, working with local communities. So we've developed some kind of broad brush land allocation guidelines to try to encourage people to put the right things in the right places. For example, not converting high-grade farmland to non-food uses like woodland or wetland. Prioritising restoring degraded peat where that occurs and not planting trees on peat. Targeting nature-based solutions, for example, to reduce erosion risk on steep slopes and erodible soils. And on areas with poor drainage, restoring wetland mosaics. And then for habitats, not planting trees on biodiverse open habitats like species-rich grassland. This is still something we see far too much of in the UK. Allowing natural regeneration where possible, which might be within 200 metres of a seed source, and considering habitat mosaics of scattered trees, scrub, heath and grass, and trying to connect those habitat fragments into networks as well. But also remembering that maps and guidelines are only a first step to support collaborative local decision making. And the final say has to go with local stakeholders and local people, bringing in their expert knowledge and ground truthing these maps. So here's an example of some maps that we've created called the Agile Opportunity Maps, where they offer a choice of options. So for example, the top arrow here points to an area where you have a choice of grassland restoration, community orchard, silver pasture or silver arable, whereas the middle one on a floodplain offers a wetland mosaic, which might be a mix of wet woodland, floodplain meadows, ponds and wetlands. And the lower area has an area next to some natural woodland where natural regeneration might be possible, but also silver pasture. So the idea is that local communities get to choose between these different options. So to wrap up with my key messages then, so our models have kind of shown that land sparing requires challenging productivity increases and is not always appropriate in some places like upland parts of Wales. And also it lacks resilience. And land sharing enhances resilience but may reduce yield of food. So combined approaches can reduce these trade-offs. And we showed that holistic pathways can free up land through productivity increases combined with dietary change and reduced food waste, so that we can meet our targets without increasing food imports. But also, which I haven't had time to discuss, anything involving these large-scale diet changes can have quite severe socioeconomic impacts, which need to be addressed on jobs, culture, and food prices, for example. And the local context must be taken into account, putting the right thing in the right place. So our policy recommendations emerging from this are that we need to invest in R&D to improve the yield of low input systems, encourage a shift to affordable, healthy plant-based diets and reduce waste, support farmers to diversify to mitigate those socioeconomic impacts, protect high-grade land for food production to reduce trade-offs, support community-led nature-based solutions tailored to the local context, and finally, that maps and models and case studies can be used to explore these alternatives and spark conversations. And I've provided some links in the slides, which will be sent around later for further information. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Alison. Was very interesting and on time perfectly. Much appreciated. We can move on to our third speaker. In the meantime, please feel free to continue posting your questions in the chat. We have Anna-Camilla Moonen. Camilla is an agroecologist focusing her research on the development and promotion of sustainable cropping systems following a landscape agronomy approach and applying agroecological principles. She applies these principles to vegetation management in and around the crop field with the objective to maximize the synergies between vegetation and a beneficial organism to foster ecosystem services provisioning. Camilla, the floor is yours. I forgot to mention that you work in Italy at the University of Pisa, Scuola Superiore Sant'Anna in Pisa.
Yeah, thank you very much. So I will try to give you very briefly some overview of the background of some research on landscape related studies for biodiversity. And so I think it will kind of wrap up a lot of things that the previous speakers have talked about. Wait, I need to get rid of this. Are you still seeing my slides?
Yeah.
Because I cannot see them. Okay, there we go. So I will briefly talk to you why we should work at the landscape level and give some ecological and socio-economic aspects of that decision, how we can work at a landscape level. So the various approaches that research has been developing to provide policymakers with useful, hopefully useful indications, and then some demos of research that we've been doing from two previous projects. One is the QUESA project, and then the framework project that Simone already talked about. So I just want to share with you some agreement on the importance of working at different levels when we talk about agroecosystems. So it's very important to consider field level studies with and combine them with cropping system, farming system, agricultural system, and land use system studies, because they all inform each other and they all interact. And landscapes, basically, they determine opportunities and constraints of agricultural activities, but at the same time, our agricultural activities determine land use structures and functions, and therefore land use patterns. And so we need, and we do this all with multiple stakeholders. So we talk a lot about farmers, but of course there are other actors involved in rural areas and in development. So they need to be involved in our research as well, to avoid, let's say, conflicts on land use opportunities. So agroecosystem management needs to be planned at these various scales and also on a temporal scale. So this means that very often you can find studies looking at land use dynamics, so studies in time, land use patterns, so looking especially at spatial land use composition and configuration aspects. And then, of course, ideally, we develop policies and recommendations for continuous space and time models. So land use composition and configuration are two very important aspects that should be taken into account into studies that look that try to determine the impact of composition, land use planning on biodiversity, because biodiversity, all the different organisms, they move into these landscapes, they respond to the patterns and the land use types they find. And these both composition and the pattern is very important. And you can see this very clearly from this slide, where we can have a similar type of composition, so the similar percentages of land use types, but if these land use types are positioned in a different configuration, they can have a huge impact on how biodiversity responds to this. So this is very important to take into account in our policies. And this is especially relevant if we think about biodiversity, and of course, if we want to support the agroecological practices, then we want to make the most of biodiversity and therefore stimulate especially the functional biodiversity. And here we should be careful to have a different different look at species with a high and a low mobility. So wild bees and butterflies, they can move. So this means that they can actually actively go and search for suitable resources in the landscape, and they can also escape from unfavorable situations. Species with a low mobility, instead, they are very much affected by local land use management decisions. And so we need to be careful to guarantee safe places for all of these organisms. So if we think about the landscape matrices, of course, we have three main units in there: the productive units, the semi-natural habitats, and of course also human settlements and infrastructure networks. They can impact strongly on the ecological functions that are taking place in a landscape. And if we look at the landscape and just analyze the land use types, then we may ignore the fact that the same land use type can be a habitat, a corridor, or a barrier for different types of species. So whenever we work with land use planning for functional biodiversity or for biodiversity in general, we need to be very careful to define very precisely what it is we're actually looking at and what we're aiming for in this specific local context. And for example, we can have woodland carabits that use hedgerows as a corridor to move through the landscape. But we can have grassland butterflies that are actually hindered by a too dense network of hedgerows in the landscape. And then we can have also some species that are specifically, basically their entire life cycle is taking place into the hedgerows. So these are different uses of different groups of animals of the same landscape. And so how can we take this into account into our studies and in our policies? So some years ago with colleagues, we proposed a landscape agronomy approach. And this approach invites everyone to always think about farming practices, natural resources, and landscape patterns together. So these three elements are very strongly connected, and between them there is a flux of constraints, as I said before. So some practices affect land use patterns, others are determined or limited by land use patterns, and all of these resources are, if we work too much in disciplinary groups, then everyone works in their own field, but we really need to work together and also educate people that have the capacity to really interact in multidisciplinary groups. So working with farmer clusters and living labs can be very, very important to actively have farmer participation, but as I said before, also all the other stakeholders that have activities in a certain area, they should be involved. And just one experience that we had from the framework project, where we try to create new farmer clusters. So have farmers work together to define their biodiversity objectives and see what practices they could, biodiversity-friendly practices they could actually implement together to have this landscape scale impact that also the previous speakers talked about. And one of the more sociological difficulties that were identified in this process is that we may identify an area which is uniform and from an agronomical and ecological point of view, but maybe the farmers, they have very different views on how to farm and what to do, and that means that collaborations become very, very difficult. So if I then want farmers to collaborate, then maybe I should aim to group farmers that are actually having similar approaches to farming and to biodiversity in such a way that they actually collaborate in a very efficient way. But this may mean that I have a kind of gaps in my landscape in terms of the impact on biodiversity. So these are this is a trade-off that I think we need to take into account. So I will just now show you some examples of outputs of the framework project. So the objective of this project, as was already a little bit indicated by Simone, is that it wanted to demonstrate that conserving biodiversity requires collaboration among farmers at a landscape level. And of course, it is especially important for the species with high mobility. And the project also supported the development of new monitoring protocols, both for scientists, but also for citizens, because it's very important that citizens and farmers themselves become sensitive to this and have tools to make their own observations. So in our local specific case study, which is a small mountain region near Pisa, which is mostly characterized by olive groves, what our idea was to, first of all, to promote this collaboration between the olive growers and the other local stakeholders. And we wanted to demonstrate the importance of these low input olive cultivation, olive growing systems on the Monte Pisano for biodiversity conservation, especially because in our region, we do not have so much a problem of conserving biodiversity, but we need to be very careful not to lose it in the future due to the fact that these low input systems in a mountain region on the terrace landscapes are becoming economically not sustainable. And therefore, if we lose the activity, then we will lose the entire system. Yes, so these were the main objectives. And so this is just an idea to give you an idea of the region. We identified 12 kilometer square areas on this mountain that were relatively homogeneous. And we used some pitfall traps in these three main semi-natural habitats on this area. So there were the herbaceous linear areas, the woody aerial areas, and then the olive groves. And we deliberately considered olive groves as a semi-natural habitat, which may sound strange to someone, but that is because they all have a spontaneous vegetation underneath. And this is therefore creating a kind of a semi-natural habitat for a lot of insects. So we did intensive pond trap monitoring for wild bees in this area. And the first result is that in terms of wild bee abundance, the olive groves are really contributing as much as herbaceous linear elements that are normally considered to be the ones that provide most floral resources. And in the woodlands, the bee abundance is a little bit lower, and this has also been shown in other studies. If we then look about flower abundance in these olive groves, they are basically the richest habitats in the region in terms of flower abundance. And each habitat actually contributes in a unique way to the composition of the vegetation, and each habitat has some species that are relatively unique to them. So that again shows another facet of biodiversity. So it's not only attracting high numbers, but it's also the contribution to conserving the individual species. Then the last example is of the Quessa project. That was also a project looking at biodiversity monitoring at a landscape scale. In this case, it was not very much focusing on collaboration among farmers. It was mostly focusing on ecosystem services provided, in our case, to the sunflower crops that are very important in this region. And we wanted to demonstrate how different semi-natural habitats in this Pisa plain area contribute to sunflower pollination and to the conservation of pollinating insects and also natural enemies. So the sampling design was relatively similar. So we had, again, pan traps in the different habitats. In the Pisa plain area, we had 5 semi-natural habitats that were dominating. So they were herbaceous and woody linear and aerial elements. And it's very important to distinguish between these linear and aerial elements, because the linear elements, of course, look much more like an ecotone, and they have a much smaller internal part. So the question is whether these elements are big enough to really support biodiversity, or if you really need aerial elements to efficiently support biodiversity. And so we compared also the wild bees and natural enemies in the internal part of the elements and in the external part. And the results showed that basically all elements contribute in a very important way to wild bee richness and abundance, and only the woody aerial elements were contain the lower wild bee richness and abundance. And the interesting thing is also to see that especially the external part of the semi-natural habitats contributed to sustaining wild bee abundance and diversity, whereas the internal parts were less rich. So this is a very strong call in favor of the maintenance of linear elements in the landscape. And of course, if we think about the speech of the previous of Alison, then if linear elements can efficiently contribute to biodiversity, it means we will occupy less space of agricultural land. So I think that is a good news. Another thing that we need to be aware of is that, as I said at the start, the same elements may not provide the same services to various groups of biodiversity. And in our study, we also demonstrated that if we increase the tree cover in our landscape, it may not be very interesting for bees, and their abundance may slightly decrease. But natural enemies absolutely thank us for planting trees because their abundance increases. And this may be explained by the fact that they find alternative prey in the tree cover. And just to finish off with, talked about ecosystem services. So sunflower production, of course, is important. And despite the fact that a lot of newer sunflower varieties are actually not completely dependent on pollination anymore, we did show that seed set and oil content were higher in the plants that actually received good pollination with respect to the ones that were excluded from pollination, and so only relied on self-pollination. So to wrap up, it is very important to work at the landscape level to take into account the complex interactions between land use patterns, biodiversity, and farmer practices. But working at a landscape scale doesn't mean that you only look at a landscape scale. It means that you look both at fields, farms, and then groups of farms. What we also saw is that olive grove agroecosystems provide if they're managed in a low input way in an agroecosystem with an agroecosystems approach, they provide very important resources, vegetation resources for sustaining a lot of biodiversity. And therefore also the maintenance of agricultural activities in areas that may not be highly productive can be very, very important. And actually, we saw similar trends between wild bees in arable cropping systems and the responses of wild bees to the same elements in olive groves. So trees were not so increasing tree cover would decrease the bee abundance a little bit. But as I said, natural animals seem to be very much in favor of the presence of trees. It is very important to create farmer clusters and living labs to discuss potential solutions with farmers. And I think my last message is really that the diversification of management and semi-natural habitats is important. So in our policies, I think it is very, very important not to try to convince farmers to all do the same thing. There is not one single solution. And yeah, as Alison also showed, it's very important to use similar approaches, but to find locally adapted solutions for biodiversity and for sustainable production. So thanks very much for listening. And if you have questions, I'm here to answer them.
Fantastic. Thanks a lot, Camilla, for your talk. And the last speaker now, we have David Baldock. Was the executive director of the Institute for European Environmental Policy for 18 years until 2016, and is now a senior fellow. He has had a career in Independent Policy Institute, working closely with the EU and national institutional and NGO, as well as academics. He joined the Institute for European Environmental Policy to initiate an agricultural policy program in the 1980s. As a director, established the Institute's Brussels office. He has written about and engaged in many aspects of European and related UK environmental, agricultural, climate, food, and related policies. Recent projects have included the work on the future of European agriculture and land use, the environmental implication of Brexit, and the development of agri-environmental policy in England. David, thank you so much for joining us. 15 minutes for you. And then I can pass you on some of the questions from our attendees.
Thank you. So I'm just trying to figure out how to share this.
Does it look like it's working, David?
Sorry?
Does it look like it's working for you if you press the share button at the bottom or more? Perfect.
Thank you. I'm not good at this. Let me just see if I can get this right. So I need to get rid of on the left, right? Okay. So does that look right?
That
Yes.
looks perfect.
Okay, thank you for inviting me. I'm going to talk a little bit about what's been happening in England since the UK left the EU and therefore departed from the CAP. And it's relevant to this discussion because the UK had to start again with an agricultural policy, and one of the fundamental ideas that it adopted was that of rewarding public goods and environmental public goods in particular as a central element of agricultural policy, which is, in theory at least, a major step towards trying to meet some of the biodiversity challenge. And it's based on a study I did for the European Commission, mostly in 2024, with a colleague, Herman Kam. The first question here is why look at England? And that is because following Brexit, the UK devolution arrangements were such that each of the 4 parts of the UK were able to embark on their own agricultural policy. England is the one which has moved fastest and furthest away from the CAP and has been most explicit in looking at environmental provision as a key measure. And this has happened in a series of steps. Firstly, adopting the public money for public goods principle. This was set out around 2018 with a consultation exercise. Then it was put into law in 2020. And under this legislation, the government is mandated to spend agricultural budget on certain objectives. And those are essentially environmental. And while this legislation was put in place, there were parallel changes in environmental policy in the UK and specifically in England. And in the English case, there was a 25-year environment plan, followed by an Environment Act, an environmental improvement plan. And the relevant part of this process of developing agriculture and environment policy together was that this created conditions for an interaction between them, which we didn't have in the same way previously. So under the Agriculture Act, the English ministers are not allowed to spend funding from the budget on a broad range of issues, unlike in the CAP, where there are 9 specific objectives and 1 horizontal one. In England, the main purpose of agricultural expenditure now is environmental improvement, but also with reference to animal welfare, increased productivity, which we'll come back to, food security, and this is very unclear, but it's generally interpreted as around 60% of national consumption should be met from domestic sources. And in the meantime, as I mentioned just now, environmental targets have been set in environmental legislation. So, for example, there's a target that 60% of soil should be sustainably managed by 2030. It's quite an ambitious target. This legislation that sets the objectives then has to be turned into actual policies which provide the sources of funding for the farming sector. And this very sort of schematic picture just shows you broadly what those policies are. The yellow block on the left is the public schemes, that's the public money. And you'll see there's various categories of expenditure, some focused on improving farm prosperity, that's mainly investment aid. There's direct payments, which is the old CAP system, which is being phased out over 7 years. These are area-based payments, which aren't associated with a particular obligation. And then you see environmental land management schemes further down there, which are the element of policy which is now expanding rapidly, and they are intended to be the dominant form of support for agriculture step by step. Going back to the top of the slide for a minute, there's something called market-based schemes. And here, as in the EU, there are aspirations to employ more private money into the agriculture sector by various means. which are going in a way relatively slowly so far. If we then look at these environmental land management being put in place, we find that the ministry concerned, DEFRA, decided that a key challenge was to get more farmers involved more readily, and to get them into fairly simple schemes with relatively few barriers to entry, and then over time coax them into a larger level of engagement in more ambitious schemes. And they decided they needed a new policy for this, what's called the Sustainable Farming Incentive. And this is developed in steps. We don't need to go into those, but it's been a slightly rocky ride. It started with a pilot scheme in 2021. Notice it's taken us quite some time since Brexit to get to this pilot scheme. Then we had a new version in 2022. Then in 2023, it changed again. And this is the 23 version is now the main one. And it is changing, but not to the level that it did in between the pilot and the 2022 one. And so we see now that we have a model, which is essentially what I'm calling a pick and mix model for the farmer. They can choose voluntarily between a large number of different actions. These are management requirements or outcome requirements in many cases. These agreements are typically for 3 years. And this scheme is still continuing to change, and it's been merged with a higher level scheme in the last year. And in fact, at the moment, it has been rather unexpectedly and suddenly suspended because the level of applications was so high. So, and the funding was totally fixed. So we've had the sort of message here is that while the principle of public money for public goods is clearly established, translating this into the core scheme has proved quite a rocky road with a lot of changes, which has made many farmers quite suspicious of it. And another important point is it doesn't aim to cover all farmland. The aim is really to cover 70% of farms. So if you compare that with some of the models we've been talking about earlier, that is rather different. The way that policy is developed in England, I just want to mention a couple of things, one of which is it was a chance to design the new model with stakeholders, with farmers, environmental organizations, and others. They have been engaged, but the general consensus, I think, amongst those who've looked at this is it certainly wasn't co-design. And another very important thing to say is that advisory schemes, which one might have expected to be quite an important element when you have a major transition for farmers like this, did not get the high level of attention that you might have thought they would. There's been a lot of investment in tests and trials and research, but translating that into actual policies has I think, been less easy. Accountability, I think it's worth saying here that, of course, in the CAP, essentially member states are accountable to the European Commission. Here, DEFRA is not accountable to the same way. It's accountable to the Treasury and various other bodies at different levels. So it's rather less clear how the accountability system works. Delivery of the policies also changed. I don't think we've got time to go into this now, but it's worth mentioning a couple of things, one of which is that the old system of cross-compliance was removed in 2024, so there's no environmental conditionality per se, and in the way there was before. And there is therefore been quite a major issue to do with farm inspections and how environmental legislation is being enforced at farm level, which has not been satisfactory in England the same way as it isn't in most European countries. And we've seen some tensions around that and actually a lot of pressure on the Environment Agency to increase its level of farm inspection, which it's now doing. Monitoring and evaluation. If you're looking to find a set of independent evaluation reports so you can study the impact and the experience of the new scheme, you will be disappointed, unfortunately, because the Agriculture Act doesn't require a system of monitoring and evaluation, or the independent evaluations which have to happen under the CAP. And what's happened in practice is we've had some evaluations, some by Natural England, particularly useful ones, but we haven't had a system of published evaluations. For example, we might be looking for one on biodiversity impact, and that's created quite a bit of lack of transparency in the system, and therefore a discussion about what the impacts of the measures will be. Quickly on the impacts, food supply and security. A lot of people feared that food supply would drop dramatically in England with the change in policy. We have set up a new system of reporting on food security by DEFRA with published indicators, and it actually does show so far very little impact in the policy change on food supply patterns. It's very early to assess this, and we can discuss why. But it's quite perhaps useful just to recall that this change in policy has happened at a time of relatively high commodity prices for several important commodities, including grain at some points, dairy at some points. So farmers who are not getting direct payments are more dependent on the market, and they're more influenced by, therefore, by market prices. And in this English model, we've got a combination of market forces and public good payments, which have to interact together. Environmental impacts, pretty hard to say how far the initial policy changes have really had an impact. We can see more uptake. It started off with very low levels of uptake, but now there are about 50,000 agreements in Environmental Land Management Scheme, so which is about halfway, a bit more to what DEFRA is looking for. And that will rise over time as the budget for these schemes goes up. But the budget is quite heavily concentrated in the lower tier, less ambitious agri-environment schemes, SFI, and the middle tier of countryside stewardship. And there's much lower rate of recruitment into the more demanding higher tier schemes, where the greatest environmental benefits are. And we're now expecting a change in the SFI where the actions will become more targeted. And that needs to happen, and farmers need to be persuaded to move up to more demanding agreements if we're going to meet biodiversity targets. And so there's been quite a lot of debate about whether the environmental targets will be reached, and the Office of Environment Protection, which is the oversight organization, has been questioning this quite hard. Productivity was mentioned before. I haven't got time to go into this, but so far we've seen rather little change in productivity in English farms since the change, but there's various factors to consider in that. And as we look ahead, we're at a point now where there's a period of early experience. There's considerable uncertainty because of the temporary closure of the bigger scheme, the SFI. The government has promised to produce a roadmap in the future of agriculture to extend the budget for the environmental land management payments, but not to the level which most independent and also sort of sector-based organizations think it need to be. It's unclear whether the regulatory levers to support incentive schemes will be used in addition as well. So finally, just a final reflection on the biodiversity element of all this. One rather positive thing about this change is there's now a clear link, which DEFRA is quite aware of, between the need to meet quantified targets for biodiversity, for example, in species numbers or habitat scale, to justify the level of expenditure on public goods. We have the potential, having considerable area of farmland now inside elms and other schemes. We've got the challenge of trying to get farmers to not only increase their participation in environmental schemes as a whole, but to progress up the scale to more demanding ones. And the public administration has got to be ready and able to support that process. And there's issues about that, given the budget for organisations like Natural England and their capacity to act. And this is an interesting contrast with the CAP, where many member states are interested in biodiversity and have measures which are aimed at enriching or protecting it, but they don't have the structure which is being created in England. So there's considerable interest in how this English experience will end, which I think will be relevant to the to Europe as a whole and not just to the UK. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, David. Fascinating talk, and many thanks to all of you. So we heard a lot of interesting science and policy aspects. We have 13 minutes to discuss some ideas. I have several questions here in the chat. Some are quite specific, and I want to go through some of them, and then we can have others that are quite more general, and then you can discuss as a group. Let's try to start with some more specific questions of your talk. One from for the first speaker, Kaley. So you mentioned at the beginning the problem of the 20 years commitment. So the question is land ownership a barrier to uptake of these longer term agreements? So can you reflect on your experience on the one of more of the case studies that you mentioned before?
Yes, thank you. I imagine it would be, but to be honest, the main barrier to putting in place longer term agreements is often the rules around the length of schemes. So that's the main, in the EU at least, that's the main barrier, because there isn't often enough funding cannot be committed for that length of time in order to have these long-term commitments. But where you do, obviously you do need to require the management to happen over a long period of time. It is possible to do that even with tenanted farms, where you get the agreement of the land manager to have that management over a period of time, and they put those requirements on the tenants that they have. So it is possible, but it can create more issues.
Thanks. There is a question that probably can be addressed, is addressed particularly to you, Kaley, but also maybe other people may answer. And it's about the idea of results-based payment. It's about how would the effect on biodiversity be measured in practice? Measuring the outcome would require a lot of manpower, is therefore not very realistic. We would need more data and probably models to scale. Can you share some ideas on this?
Well, that's a really interesting question, because actually there are quite a lot of examples of results-based schemes in the EU now. They're growing, and biodiversity is one of those where it has been possible to develop indicators. And what the most common design, if you like, is to identify a number of indicator species that you want to see, and those obviously have to be locally relevant. And then and you decide what your threshold is. So it could be 4, 8, 10, 12 species, it depends how demanding you want to be, or you could have scaled payments depending on how many species you have. And often those are measured through a transect approach, and farmers are involved themselves in measuring those results. So it involves the active engagement with farmers to walk the transects, to note the species, and to submit those. And yes, of course, an advisor, you know, there need to be checks as well. But actually, it's a really good way of engaging the farmer and in knowing what's going on in their fields, and that's the approach that's been taken in many countries in the EU, Germany, France, Austria, Slovenia now as well, I think. So yeah, that's the main idea.
Hey, thanks a lot. What about in your case, Alison and Camilla? So you had some, of course, indicators for biodiversity. Were these chosen at the top level, top-down approach in order to fit your models, or they were discussed at the bottom level with some stakeholders? Maybe this can be true for the case of Camilla. I don't know, for Alison, for you, that you are working with modeling.
Yes, so just very briefly then, I think Camilla will have more to say on this, but for the modelling point of view, we did choose really high level indicators based on the area of habitat available, and we had some other indicators on use of agrochemicals and deforestation rates, for example. But yes, of course, these need to be backed up with much more local sort of field level measurements, and I think probably Camilla's got more to say on that.
Mm-hmm. Please,
Yeah,
Camilla.
not so much. It's a little bit difficult because it depends very much what you're working on and what you're aiming at. So in our specific case, we worked with pollinators. In the case of the sunflower arable cropping systems, sunflower is definitely a crop that is interested in this service. So that was in that case, it was very much functional biodiversity. In the case of the olive groves, the olive trees do not really need pollination by insects, but of course the insects are the ones that, especially the wild pollinators, they maintain floral diversity, because a lot of spontaneous plants need pollination. So in that case, the bees are more an indicator also of the capacity of the system to maintain floral diversity. The farmers in that case are much less interested in bees, but they do recognize the importance of these species. And for example, because of we also monitored butterflies, so I didn't show anything about that, but butterflies, of course, are a very easy indicator because everyone sees them, and it's relatively easy also to monitor them in a not professional way. So that was a species that the farmers suggested because they observed the differences in butterflies in our landscapes.
Yes, thanks. And just by curiosity, and then I move back to the questions from our attendees. The choice, of course, is not necessarily aligned to what is requested by the legislation, you know, because there is some directives, the habitat directives, but also the common agriculture policy probably requires some specific information on some birds or insects that probably, but probably you're going to work a little bit more deeply. So you are selecting different species that are more relevant at the local scale. I don't know if it's Camilla or Alison. So you selected something.
I think that's what Alison was saying. If you work with a group of farmers and they want to have payments for this objective, then of course you need to be much more specific, and you need to identify exactly which are the species that are locally relevant. Mm-hmm. So that was not the case of the framework project. It was just a matter of general comparison of how habitats contribute to species abundance and composition. But yeah, definitely that would be a next step in case you want to pay people for reaching an objective, then it becomes much stricter.
Yeah, thanks a lot. I move to David, a specific question for you. What lessons have emerged from the early implementation of the ELMS that could inform future revisions of biodiversity-related land management schemes?
I think one lesson that's emerged is it's important to, I think, engage the farming community, scientific community, expertise quite intensely and with a sense of realism about what's achievable and what the parameters are in a slightly different framework than happened in England. Secondly, I think the strategy of relying on a kind of a very potentially attractive scheme for farmers with rather little environmental value added was probably too much, too central to the English approach. It would have been better to have tried to ramp up some of the more ambitious schemes faster. And in doing that, I think it would have been helpful to put more money into farm level advice and technical support to help farmers adapt to a different approach. So I think we've seen a number of lessons we could draw out and reflect on a bit more over the next few years.
Mm-hmm. Yes, thanks. I would like to move to some more common general questions that are taken in consideration of your activities, your work from the scientific and policy area. And in particular, you mentioned in your talk the need of information, so working together with communities. And the question is, how can we effectively engage with agricultural communities on these topics and encourage effective policy uptake and implementation? So we can start from the first speaker, Kaley. We go in order.
Yes, I mean, it's a good question. I think the first point is to talk to farmers and involve them in the design of schemes and to work locally with farmers to understand what their needs are and what it is that they want to, you know, what their needs are in terms of the economics of their system, but also then engaging proactively with them about, well, how to incorporate biodiversity within that. What does that mean for their system? Because there are ways in which you can incorporate biodiversity, you know, as Alison was showing, which are perhaps not as perhaps don't have as big an economic effect as they might anticipate, and they might also gain benefits from that. And I think the issue about peer-to-peer learning is really important, because once you do have these sort of farm leaders, if you like, once somebody starts doing something in an area and they have success with that, then news spreads quickly, and speaking to their neighbours, and often farmers will take advice from other farmers, sort of perhaps better than they will from people that perhaps they perceive are less you know, familiar perhaps with what they're trying to achieve.
Thank you. Alison, your point of view?
Yes, I agree with all of that. Also, really important to have consistent policy signals from government. So as David mentioned, our SFI scheme was abruptly paused. There was meant to be a 6-week notice period for that, but it was just stopped overnight. And I think that sort of thing really undermines confidence amongst farmers. A lot of farmers in the UK are struggling economically. There's really high rates of farmers going out of business, really high rates of mental health issues. So it's really important to understand the stresses that farmers are under and kind of go and talk to them, meet them where they are, and understand the stresses that they're facing day to day, and really kind of try to understand those issues. And then I think a lot of farmers in the UK certainly are really keen to do more for nature, but they need to also keep their businesses surviving. So, you know, so they just really need that strong policy support from government.
Absolutely. Thanks. Camilla?
Yeah, I think I just want to confirm what Alison just said. I spoke to some farmers just recently, and they're really under a lot of stress. They're desperate for two things: work, like they cannot find workforce anymore. So they really have difficulty in doing all the farming operations. So they try to be as efficient as possible. And this really impacts also the choices they make in terms of their cropping systems and their farming operations. And the other thing is that young people do not want to go into farming anymore. And so we really are facing like a couple of the younger ones. So they're still, they're around their 40s. So let's call them younger ones. They really said that they think they are the last generation. So the question is what will happen afterwards? And a very, for me, worrying pattern I see is that land is being bought to put agrivoltaic stuff on that, and it's not agri, it's just, it's a loss of quality land. And I think this is very, very worrying, and talking about biodiversity is not supporting that in any way. So I mean, if there's no farming, there's no farmland biodiversity. So maybe we need to take into account these very urgent questions of farmers as well.
Yes, thanks, David. You briefly replied to these questions from your previous answer. Consider that we had some not very positive messages from the last speakers about these questions. Can you, and considering that it's 1:02, can you close up with a positive message? You can see
I'm going to be slightly more positive. Yes, I don't think farming is going to disappear in Europe. I think farms, unfortunately, will get bigger, and they'll run on a tougher and tougher economic logic. So what we therefore have to do is to actually make biodiversity conservation quite central to that logic. So that message has to come through the policy machine, but also it's got to come through the market. So the retailers, the processors, the co-ops, the people buying food from farmers have got to realize that biodiversity conservation is actually part of the core mission for agriculture in Europe, and they're going to have to help pay for that. It can't all come through the policy. They need to support farmers in that, and I don't think we quite got through that revolution yet. I mean, some of them are beginning to see the beginning of that message, but that needs to be understood much more firmly, and I think that's achievable. I'm not saying it's easy.
Okay. Thanks a lot for your positive message. I realize that it's 3 minutes past. Many thanks, David, Alison, Kaley, and Camilla, for your contribution. And many thanks to all our attendees to have spent the last 90 minutes with us. And I welcome you soon to a new seminar organized by the Natural Capital Initiative. Thank you so much, and bye-bye.